Today, I'm pretty excited to bring in the folks at Extend and talk a little bit more about document automation. I think as most people know, if you've worked in the enterprise, manual document workflows still swallow up like a ton of effort and causes a bunch of errors in production. And I think yeah, like even in construction, for example, it takes like a million documents really just under for a single building. And so we're processing like PDFs, invoices, forms like every day. And today I'm really excited to bring in Eli, who is the CTO of Extend, and to really talk a little bit more about AI native document processing in the cloud. I think you guys are hitting like 95 plus extraction accuracy for customers like Brex and other Fortune 500s. And so I think in the next 30 minutes, you'll lay out the playbook that you guys have around sort of mapping your current flows, building task-specific evals, and then thinking about, partial automation, human in the loop. And, I'm really excited to hear what you guys have to say. Just as a call out, if anyone has questions, we'll do them at the end. And Maren has shared a link in the bottom for Slido. And so just ask your questions there. We will upvote the questions that people want to hear most, and we can, go from there at the end of the talk. And so, yeah, with that, Eli, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the intro, Jason. Super excited to be here. I've listened to a few of these and excited to contribute to the content here. So yeah, we're going to talk today about kind of document automation lessons at scale, like how to go from zero to in production with everything from startups to Fortune 500s and just all the different challenges that prop up. Even across industries, they tend to be pretty consistent, the different types of like issues you'll run into trying to automate an end-to-end flow. And want to like talk about those common failure cases and best practices. So just a little bit about us. We're a startup, all in person in New York, growing and supporting some of the most cutting edge teams in the industry. Everyone from like fintechs like Brex and Mercury to healthcare companies like Flatiron, everything in between. Work with some of the one of the largest like real estate marketplaces, a top 5 global logistics provider, and one of the larger neobanks. So we've seen kind of it all. Everything from like, you know, small use cases around like ingestion to like powering critical document workflows that power a given industry like logistics. Yeah, so for today, just gonna give you a quick agenda and TLDR if you don't stay the whole time. So we're gonna go an overview of like what is document processing because it's extremely broad and like kind of different types of use case, and then the specific type of use case we want to focus on today, and then talk about some real world use cases and then tie those specifically to common failure cases in with like a given example, and then like common ways to handle it and best practices to fix them, and then we'll kind of close out. The TLDR of like key learnings, if you just wanted to grok the Spark Notes here. First and foremost, and I'm sure that this is something Jason has hammered in like many times in a lot of these different sessions, but you really need to understand your data. In the case of document processing and specifically like document automation in a operational flow, it's not just understanding the data, it's understanding the specific documents, but the existing manual processes around them. I think you'll find that a lot of companies, there's an enormous amount of tacit knowledge that's kind of like hidden in the company, in people's heads, whether it's engineering, operations, domain experts of some kind, that makes it extremely difficult to automate if you don't fully understand what's actually happening today from either a data perspective or a process perspective. And I'll give a couple examples in the real world of that. The second key learning is that you need to invest very early in evals. It's essentially going to come down to how good are your evals at the specific task you're trying to do. It can be tempting with like document processing to think of things from a just like broad landscape benchmarking perspective, but in practice, when you're trying to automate like an end-to-end flow, the evals actually need to be very tailored to like your domain, how you think about the data, how you think about the process, and we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail. Third, kind of like big takeaway that you should have is if you're automating like a document-based workflow, a common failure case is shooting for like 100% automation at the start and creating unrealistic bar to hit from an accuracy perspective, and even just like a change management perspective, going from manual to automated. And it's a lot better to kind of start with like piecewise automation. And we can talk about what that looks like. And then the final is like one also common mistake is trying to go for like a one-to-one replacement of an existing process rather than thinking about the process from scratch with automation in mind. And we found that generally it can be very difficult to just full swap out something that's been done over many years among many different stakeholders and just make that automated, as opposed to really understanding as an engineer, what is the end-to-end process that's happening around this unstructured data and these documents being passed through all these different parties, and trying to redesign the process around automation from the get-go. So those are kind of the key learnings that we'll get into in more detail here. But start, really quick overview, because again, document processing is a really broad term, as I'm sure many folks on this call know. There are kind of like three broad strokes of use cases, with kind of like forks within them, but it's everything from like ingestion is one bucket, back office like processing when documents kind of serve as like a system of record. It's another bucket, and then kind of like in-product experiences, or maybe like the more traditional OCR, uploading an invoice, getting data back. In case of ingestion, that's like RAG, context for agents, data mining. And then the back office processing, that is the bucket I kind of want to focus on for this call, because I think it's one of the lesser discussed kind of topics. But if you're an AI engineer at like a startup trying to reinvent a vertical, or you're like an AI engineer at like a large enterprise that's trying to reinvent its operations, this is actually going to be one of the most critical types of use cases for you. And it has a lot of unintuitive challenges. And this is when you're trying to automate end-to-end workflows. And really, again, it's like you're processing some kind of system of record, like a contract or, like a deed or anything that like there's really no room for error in practice in the end-to-end production flow. And so as a quick kind of like highlight of like what document processing encompasses at the limit across all these use cases, it's everything from the, again, the OCR parsing, chunking, ingestion piece of it, the context management, then the engineering of that context to do effective extraction, splitting, classification, et cetera. Then the data labeling and evaluation around these processes, the orchestration of a multi-step flow to process a document, and then even human in the loop components and like real-time feedback loops to improve the system over time. That's kind of like the end-to-end full stack of document processing. Cool. So yeah, biggest thing I just want to call out in the very beginning, like the most common failure case here is like people try and one-shot it. So, they're trying to automate some kind of manual operation that involves documents and think, okay, I know that, we've got ChatGPT. I dumped a document in, it worked really well. It looks like it extracted perfectly. I think I can just automate this entire thing, get rid of the humans, just change the entire process all from this one shot. In practice, that will never work. Even if the use case is not that complex and the accuracy on the extraction is going to be close to perfect, it's extraordinarily difficult to just like swap out a manual process for an automated process in practice. And it's really just like the first thing you should avoid. If you're on a team that's exploring trying to automate a workflow in an industry, in a vertical, and you're talking about like people are saying, oh, we're going to be able to replace the entire thing and cut costs by X margin. So like that should throw up alarm bells. And it's not actually going to happen the way you imagine it. And it's going to set up the, team not for success, the product team, the business stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, just don't try and one shot it. I'm going to go over 3 use cases to talk about the other key learnings here. The first one that I think is pretty interesting, and one of the first use cases that we helped the team to solve, is automated SaaS, or like software contract ingestion. So the context is these folks have to they have to ingest like their customers' systems of record regarding their software purchases to build an accurate model of pricing data. And the thing to understand here is that like, I mean, I'm sure many people on this call have like purchased software, whether it's like Datadog or something else. And at the enterprise, you tend to see a lot of different documents involved in that transaction. It's not just the invoice. It's like the order form prior to the invoice. It's the statement of work. It's like a DPA and MSA, terms, all these different documents that kind of go into the package of like contracts being exchanged here. There are a lot of different challenges. Again, there's these different documents, and then even within a document type, like one of the more critical ones typically is an order form. There's high variance within that type across different suppliers, different pricing methodologies. I mean, think about all the different ways software can price things across like industries, features, et cetera, and then kind of complex mapping problems around those types of terms. The goals for this team when they started working with us was twofold. They were trying to automate a heavily manual process that existed today. But then on top of that, they wanted to process a lot of data that just could not be processed before because it was economically unfeasible to do it purely manual relative to the ROI that they would have had from a business standpoint. So that was kind of what they were trying to do. I think this customer in particular, above all that we've worked with, I think really crystallizes both the failure that can happen at the start and then how much you can improve things from understanding your data and existing process. So when they signed on, again, one of our earlier customers, they kind of went full steam ahead, rolled out very quickly, wanted to just get this live as fast as possible and start processing all these documents and rip out their existing flow. And as you maybe can imagine, that caused all kinds of issues because not only was accuracy not high enough, it was just difficult to actually roll this out, do the whole change management. A lot of things were breaking downstream for them. The quality was not what it needed to be. They even at one point considered just abandoning the entire thing, I think briefly. But what they ended up kind of refocusing on and working with us and our platform and tooling to do was just kind of like take a step back and then really understand all the documents that are coming in here. And they did this in a very actually interesting way that I think people on this call could learn from. So it was sort of like 4 key things that they did. One was they just went to actually a human in the loop flow. So take the existing document flow that was using the AI-driven document automation, but still routed everything to a human, regardless of whether they thought it was accurate or not, just so they could really robustly collect like production data separate from the evals that they'd already created. 2 is they looped in domain experts, not on the engineering team, that were in the company that had actually been previously doing this manually, and had them get involved in tailoring the classifications and schema design so that better mapped like the jargon and again like the tacit knowledge of the industry that the engineers who initially set this up did not have. And then third, the most important, which I think is the most interesting thing that probably everyone could explore in some way for a given use case you're looking to for document automation, is they created a series of extractors for these documents that were just trying to characterize normalized attributes, like who is the supplier, what kind of layout does this have, what kind of pricing terminologies has, just like sort of open-ended, like, enum-based characterizations of the document. Again, not trying to extract data to action on it. It's really just create a huge set of like categories that they can map these documents into and then cluster them. And they ran this whole workflow on, I think, around 200,000 or so, maybe 150,000 documents, close to like 1 million pages in like one bulk ingest. So they could have a very accurate representation of all their historical data. And then from there, be able to assess like again, cluster that data and map it back to like the known label data that they have too, and figure out, all right, what suppliers are actually a problem here? What kind of pricing terms are we not extracting correctly? What blind spots do we have in our existing flow around the document classifications? Like, are we just getting documents that we didn't even really know we were getting from like a general understanding of their own flow? And they did this and really invested in it over the course of quite some time, and then came back and fully redesigned their existing document workflows with all this new knowledge, and then reinvested in much more tailored extractors and evals. And now they are running fully autonomously on this ingestion of software contract data, and it's awesome. And I think it was this was the type of thing that I don't think everyone would think to do, but they had the idea to do it. And I would strongly recommend it to any team that's like trying to automate a very messy document ingestion flow. Take some kind of initial first pass that is entirely focused on understanding the data, not actually trying to, get the data out, if that makes sense. And then they ended up with like this very multi-step classification process in the document workflow that was trying to classify these different things that they knew would correspond to different issues that they could route more deterministically to. Like, okay, if it's this supplier, we're going to extract, the line items in this specific way versus that supplier, because we know that we can get that to an extremely high clip of accuracy when we tailor it that way. Cool. So yeah, that was one very big key learning. Again, understand your data, understand your existing process, get creative in how you try and figure that out. So second use case here. This is automating document workflows in like home health. So this is a vertical AI team that we work with that uses our platform to build everything from like, RAG ingestion flows and then to automating like complex multi-step like healthcare documentation workflows for their customers, which are various kinds of healthcare providers. The goal here was automated EHR entry of like referral orders and kind of the associated data. The challenges with this use case are that referral order packages come in these like 100 plus, oftentimes like multi-hundred page scanned PDFs that can have many different referrals in one document, kind of like this like history of a patient mixed in with doctor's notes, provider notes, all kinds of like messy data that's all lumped together into like one referral package. And then even across that, there's like high variance within the documents. Oh, whoops, I think I copied that from the wrong slide. But there's high variance within the orders themselves, like across different healthcare providers, insurance providers, home health like services. It gets extremely complex, not only from the fact that there's a bunch of different documents lumped together, but then within each category type of the sub documents in the package. So in order to solve this in general, they were already going to use our splitting capabilities and extraction, et cetera. But the like first pass itself was not really enough. And when they first signed on, they were like super happy. They got set up. They tried to go live. Again, common failure case. Let's go live immediately. We're going to extract all the data. We're going to run through every document. We're not going to have humans involved in this process. We're going to then just like automate the entire thing for our customers. Of course, that did not go well out of the gate. There were all kinds of issues they ran into. There's a lot of unknown unknowns with any different document automation process. Again, like in an existing company, it's typically tacit knowledge within the organization. When you're like a vertical AI team working with your customers, it's just like knowledge that's not documented anywhere. Like you don't even fully have an understanding of the unknown unknowns in this case. In this case. So yeah, one of the interesting things that they did here in order to invest in evals is they actually brought their AI engineers of this team worked with in-house nurses and medical technicians, like medical, I forget the exact term. That's like someone that works with a doctor. Let's call it a medical technician. In order to build very, very, very robust, fine-grained, comprehensive eval sets across a huge variety of different example documents, and then optimize again with the nurses, optimizing the schemas and really like the kind of the extraction rules where they could kind of encode like their domain expertise around how to interpret certain kind of like doctor jargon and then map that back into rules for the schema extraction in order to properly extract the data so that they could, again, like map it into their internal system and then action on it for their customers. It was actually really cool to see. And it showed the power of evals and looping in domain experts in order to create this sort of like flywheel effect. And one of the big benefits here is that not only did this allow them to kind of take a step back and like roll out with confidence in like a more controlled way, they also have all this like proprietary eval data that is like their competitive advantage in their industry. So that as new models come out, as we release new versions of our extractors and our splitters, they can very quickly and confidently like, run those, do a regression test, make sure it's only strictly improvement, and then roll out and kind of get that like fast iteration loop. And then on top of that, what they did is they still like take some like I don't know exactly how they determine what percentage of documents they're going to human review, but they still do a slice just to still understand the like real world production data as it's changing. Because that's like a very important thing for everyone to keep in mind. Like whenever you're automating some kind of workflow or some kind of ingestion process, like the data will change over time in so many different ways. In their case, it's if they start working with new providers. And so they want to always keep that like fresh loop of like, production data to eval. Yeah, and then even like things that you might not think about, like actually creating evaluation sets for the splitter itself, not just even the extractors. Because again, like if you're doing a multi-step pipeline and even if you get extraction in like a contained way to like close to 100% accuracy, if the initial step of splitting the document is wrong, the entire pipeline is broken down. And so you really need to invest at evals at every step of a flow when you're trying to automate an end-to-end document process. Okay, like third and final use case that we'll go into the next key learning, and this is automated claims reconciliation for like dental billing. Our image here is actually a fun one. We created all these like document themed cookies, and one of our favorite use cases are these explanation of benefits documents on this team that we work with. And so here's an example of one of those cookies. But yeah, so the context on this one is it's a vertical AI startup automating back offices for dental billing. Their goals were to safely automate as many EOBs, like explanation of benefits documents, as possible to scale their service, providing without all error. Because again, they kind of like run this like back office dental billing for their customers, and in fact, even like kind of roll up a few like small business dental billing providers. And the challenges for them is that, again, kind of similar to any sort of healthcare insurance use case, they had these 100+ page explanation of benefits documents with very complex tables and chunking requirements because of how different claims can stretch across like page boundaries. There's not as much logical section chunking that actually separates things. It's purely semantic, like of like these notes correspond to this claim and these procedures, etc. And so it's, yeah, again, there's not much in the like PDF structure itself to be able to chunk on, just generally. And so again, that creates a lot of complexity that they had to deal with, and why they were kind of using our tooling to manage that chunking and extraction. But again, it ended up being a little more complex in process than just figuring out the chunking, because they realized over time that they actually had to break this out into a very multi-step process where they could just segment the problem, like, trim the amount of things that have to be solved at one point in time by one like module, extractor, classifier, etc. And then also kind of control the inputs where, if they can like know that certain providers have certain kinds of edge cases and other providers have other kinds of edge cases, they can create configuration workflows for each of those providers that they most often work with, and then have like a long tail catch-all. And a key thing that they also did in order to like focus on what's called like maybe true automation rate, where they're not trying to optimize to just getting to 98% plus accuracy on like some arbitrary measure of like extracted data from one document. They want to go to how high of an accuracy can we get where the end-to-end pipeline works 100%, and the times where it's not working, where it's inaccurate, we catch those 100% of the time. So what that means is like, let's say we have 98% accuracy, but we don't really know the 2% that are not going to work. That's actually in most cases for like these critical systems of records like ingestion use cases, that's strictly worse than if you can get to like 85% true automation rate, where the 15% of the time that's not going to properly handle the document, you can catch that declaratively and then loop that to like some kind of manual human oriented process. And so they again thought through this pretty early on and took this approach where they used all these kinds of data validations and guardrails in their system that kind of wrapped the document processing so that they could very declaratively know, okay, this one that went through, that was correct, and we can just now action on that. This one, for X, Y, and Z factor, we are not confident that it actually was, the whole pipeline worked properly. We're now going to send this to one of our manual operations teams to handle this. And again, that's the data validations. Some of that actually is LLM driven checks that they built, and measured to ensure that like this works. We have a good true positive, and true negative rate. And then measure that human loop system over time to constantly make sure that there's not like a drift in the success rate. And then, the last thing is like, they also, in order to make this all work well, try to really design the process from scratch around this automation. And, there's some benefits they had here where, because they actually like in-housed like a billing team, they could kind of control some of the variables so that it could be automated, in a better way, which is sometimes challenging if you're building more of like a SaaS product where you do not have control over how the customers are actually going to do things. But if you can in some ways control the process, design the end-to-end flow around being able to actually validate it, that's like the most important thing, because you can get accuracy maybe as high as you need it to, but if you can declaratively validate, you can kind of roll out anything into production in some form. And that's like a really key thing when you're dealing with these, again, like systems of records like exchanges, where the document is very critical data that's being exchanged between two parties where there's zero room for error. So yeah, that's kind of like the other key learning there. Now, yeah, kind of taking it home, summary here. Understand your data, an existing manual process. That is like above all the most important thing by far for any kind of like AI automation that you're doing around documents. Really, just AI automation in general. You can't automate something you don't understand. And then two is invest early in like very tailored evals to your use case. Lean away from kind of like broad strokes, benchmarks. Like it's great if like Gemini Flash is better than like GPT-X at like one different thing. It doesn't necessarily matter in practice. Like it might not, and you really need tailored evals to your domain and your data. Yeah, break things into multiple steps through a pipeline, from parsing, classification, splitting, multiple, potential rounds of that. And then extraction, semantic chunking, just like think of it as like a pipeline to process a document in the context of a workflow. Four is don't shoot for 100% automation at the start. And then five is rethink your process as much as possible when you can around automation, as opposed to just trying to hot swap in this like surgical, transplant like way from zero automation to full automation. Yep. Any
Awesome.
questions?
Thank you. We'll go over some of the questions in the Slido first, but I'm actually curious, like, how do you think about You mentioned a lot about like change management. Like, how do you communicate or like do expectation setting when you work with these customers, and how do you actually think about this kind of change management?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that is something that we've gotten better at over time because it depends on it somewhat depends on the circumstance. If we're working with a team that's more of like a vertical AI team where they're actually the ones like automating a specific vertical industry, then it's more kind of like educating them about the problems and pitfalls that they will run into by trying to do this document automation so that they can from the get-go think about how they're going to build this into their product experience for their customers or how they're going to try and change this flow. Because going back to that second use case that we talked about, um, I think that team, we did not do a good job of like explaining to them the challenges of change management they were going to run into by trying to automate this like from scratch. And if we had done that better up front, which I think we do more with like our current customers, then they will be more set up for success. And that kind of like closes the loop. In other cases, we're working with more just like a vertical business, like maybe like an enterprise in logistics. It's actually like an extremely critical part of like almost like the sales process and discovery process where we understand like what are you currently doing today, walk us through it end to end so we can identify, there's a lot of like common patterns we can look out for. And if you get them to kind of talk through it, you can see like, oh, it's already clear that they're making the mistake of they're going to be able to go from many, many humans to zero humans the moment they roll out extend. And that is like an immediate thing where we try and throw up alarm bells and explain to them that A, not only will that not work, B, it's going to be very difficult for you to actually convince your internal stakeholders that that's like okay. So you
Yeah.
should start like we lead almost with trying to help them build a human in the loop system from scratch so that they then again can collect the data, but then also like most companies are much more willing to roll something out and deal with the change management if you focus on kind of augmentation at start and then turn augmentation into automation. And we even have this kind of catchphrase that we do in our sales process. It's like automate when possible, augment otherwise is kind of like the main way to think about any sort of workflow automation, particularly
Mm.
when there's like unstructured data in systems of record and that it's so critical.
Yeah. And I guess to follow up on that, like as you start onboarding these customers, it sounds like a bit of that process is sort of like investing in the ontology that they want to build out.
Yeah.
Um, how do you suggest these companies think about building this thing? I think there's been many times where companies will talk to me and they want to do a knowledge graph, but they really haven't thought about what
Right.
ontology looks like. And then sort of you waste a lot of time, you burn a lot of cycles figuring out what that is. You mentioned this clustering technique, but I don't think I had a good understanding of what that actually
I'll
looks like.
mention this.
The like the clustering on the fields and then
Oh, yeah. Well, so I mean, so that's a bit for a knowledge graph, I'm not totally sure what you do there. But in the case of like, let's say you're trying to do data extraction,
yeah.
what that team did, which I think is a very effective strategy that most people could lean into, is they did their whole process where they rolled out with extraction first and realized there were all kinds of issues. And they, as like humans, looked through a lot of the data and tried to like use your own kind of like mental machine learning models to understand what are the common patterns of issues here, like what types of documents are causing problems. It seems like certain types of suppliers are causing issues, certain types of pricing structures are causing issue, certain types of layouts are causing issue, et cetera, et cetera. They created these like characterizations of the document that are not like the actual data extraction itself, but it's more like a class of a specific classification of the document. They turned that into like a schema of enums and they ran a large bulk ingest of documents just to map it into these categories and then cluster them together to see of these different categories which ones have more accuracy issues than others. So it's a pretty kind of like involved process and they're a fairly
Yeah.
technical team. But if you can do that, if you can kind of like group and categorize and triage the specific issues, then you have a way better understanding of like what the data actually looks like. Then if you work with a domain expert, you can kind of work backwards to effective pipelining of like, here are the multiple steps of classification we're going to do. And at each point, this is the extraction we're going to try and do from that. You kind of turn it into like a software process as opposed to a like, um, you know, blob in, blob out AI process.
Got it. Got it. Just looking at some of these questions, one of them is mostly around sort of techniques. The question is semantic chunking not very expensive to run? Any options on how to do it cheaply, or what are the alternatives one should think about?
Yeah, I mean, so semantic chunking can be expensive and slow, especially for these very large documents. If cost is a factor, I mean, we often like in our product, we have like a concept of like, cheap, fast models versus performance, higher accuracy models. And in the cases of chunking, it's actually not all that challenging of a task that smaller models can do effectively. Model distillation is actually a really great thing to do here for something like chunking. So if you take like your best model, you run the chunking on a bunch of samples, and you clean out the ones that did not work, and then you just distill that into a smaller model. That is a good way to like make this more affordable. It doesn't always solve the speed problem, because there are a lot of reasons, even if you're using an extremely fast model to do effective semantic chunking, you kind of have to do multiple passes through a document to actually understand how to chunk it, right? And that can be time consuming. It's not really something you can do for like that third type of use case, going way back to the beginning of the slides, where, let's say it's a user uploading a document. Semantic chunking is probably going to be, at least right now, too slow, no matter what approach you take. But if it's like if it's a back office flow, I would encourage everyone on this call to not really like think about latency as a problem. In fact, you should think about designing a process where you can effectively remove latency as being a consideration, because it's really just it's kind of like a counterproductive problem when you're trying to automate something that's back office. And it's better to, again, like think from first principles. How can we design this process around the fact that there's going to be this async processing, and then we can control the variables and then just focus on performance, 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 because accuracy is a premium when you're dealing with systems of record rather than latency. But that being said, like, I mean, cost definitely can be a factor here. But that's where I would really encourage you to do model distillation.
Yeah. I think for a lot of different talks, it really has come down to this idea that it really isn't just about whether something is fast or whether something is good, but really understanding like what is your performance budget?
Right.
Like how much can you spend on the tokens versus the time and versus, inference and whatnot. And, it's always going to be like multiple degrees of freedom that we explore.
Yeah.
Uh, it's not the case like RAG is dead and long context is the winner. Well, things might take more money. Is the recall worth the additional cost, worth the maintenance cost of doing your own inference? Those are the big things to think about.
Or like a compounder we'll see is people will use like a light fast classifier to like do the initial classification step, so that they don't run semantic chunking or don't run splitting on every document, because it's expensive and slow. And that's a very common pattern. So like classification, much easier task in most cases. Do a bunch of pass through using faster, cheaper models that you've kind of like designed this process around, so that you don't have to like jam. You don't think of it as like, okay, here's the total number of N documents that we're going to process. Now let me multiply that by the cost of doing semantic chunking, and then conclusion, too expensive. Instead, think through like, well, what can we change the process? Can we do a pre-filtering step that's extremely cheap, and then actually cut out so that we only chunk the things where that matters? That's like another very common pattern.
Yeah, I think segmentation and specialization will definitely be useful for all time, I think.
Yeah.
Uh, I guess this question is mostly around like how do you guys think about yourselves relative to, a business like Reductive, where I think most of what I've seen them do is around the PDF to like markdown data
Okay.
output. But yeah, I would love to hear a little bit more about how you guys think about your approaches and how they differ.
Yeah, I think Reductive is a great team. There's definitely some overlap. At the end of the day, like document processing is a very broad space. I think the main kind of difference, at least what type tends to lead to us having fairly different customers than them in some cases, is that we I think, well, they focus very heavily on like RAG as a use case. So they tend to very much optimize their system and their API around that problem. We view more of the parsing as and chunking and all the things that we do to make this work well as kind of like a means to an end in order to do very effective processing, if that makes sense. And so in practice, while again there can be a lot of overlap there because it's all still document processing, we've really designed our product and our expertise and our capabilities around these very complex multi-step processing of documents. And so we tend to more work with companies that are doing these either like either AI teams building these like workflows around back office ingestion, or they're large enterprises doing that kind of processing, or actually they're building like user upload flows with, processing invoices, order forms, etc. Our product tends to be like a bit of a better fit there, as opposed to, I think, in Reductive, because they focus so heavily on their parse API. That's something that they do very well, even though I think in practice, we actually do very similar things in the parsing. We both use OCR and VLM to create a representation of the document. We both do different kinds of chunking strategies and layout segmentation and like section-based chunking or semantic chunking, et cetera, to do all this. Focus a lot on like high quality tables and figure detection. So the problems end up being very similar, but then like where you throw those solutions and invest ends up being a bit different, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's a lot about like what does success look like in these cases. For
Yeah.
me, when I use something like document or Reductive, I just want the data.
Yes, exactly.
The invoice is processed, it's actually put back into the system, and
Right.
we believe that like this result is fully accurate.
Yeah, and I think that's like the main difference, right? So if you're doing a document conversion process, there is actually in some ways a more objective measure of accuracy, right? Because there's not two different ways in practice, like at the like kind of theoretical limit of accuracy to create a markdown representation of a document. There are kind of like more objective, better and worse ways. Where if you're dealing with a system of record and you're a business and you process that system of record in a certain way, then the accuracy is somewhat subjective to your process, right? And so again, the product needs to be heavily oriented around trying to evaluate and measure and improve accuracy on my unique like schema and pipeline. And I think that kind of leads to the difference there.
Mhm. I guess to sort of think a little bit bigger on like what are the things people are missing these days, we've asked you a couple of questions. Like what is a question you feel like folks are not thinking about these days when it comes to these like documentation pipelines? Like is there going to be, is it mostly around like how do we train domain experts for like different UIs? Yeah, I'm curious
Yeah.
to hear a little bit more about,
I
what
think
do
I think
you not asking?
I think it's two things. I think that at least of all the teams we've talked to, it's a lot of them. Actually, it's three things. With the domain expert one, I don't think it's that every team thinks about trying to use like the domain expert in their industry, whether it's like the nurse, even if they're like an AI team, they might not think like, oh, we could actually put our nurses as part of understanding this process and understanding the data and understanding the prompting. I've only seen a subset of teams actually take that approach, and when they do, it tends to be an extreme competitive advantage. And so I think if you're like, what question are you not asking? It's like, if you're an engineer and you're tasked with this kind of problem, like, your PM gave it to you and you're like, your top down CEOs, like, we got to start automating these documents. And you don't feel like you actually understand this process, someone on your team has to, right? If you're doing this currently. And if you're in industry, someone understands this. And so from the get-go, figuring out how to loop in those people and make them a part of it is actually very important. And you should ask like, do I really know what's happening here? The second piece, somewhat related to it, I think a common pattern that I see is that, especially at like larger late stage tech companies that are spinning up these AI teams, there's a bit of a inclination that the AI team wants to protect every product team from thinking about these problems. Is one approach that we've seen where they sort of centralize it and say anything that relates to like AI or document processing, that's going to like roll through us. What the problem there is, again, going back, kind of relates to the first problem, is that in a lot of cases, it's actually probably those like product and operations teams that understand the process a lot better. And so instead, it's like, how can they leverage you, the AI team, to help them build this, whether it's using tooling or internal or whatever it is, so that they are then empowered to customize the process and tailor it to their use case, as opposed to making yourself, the AI team, the blocker to getting anything done or changing anything here. Because not only is that not effective from an organizational structure standpoint, it's not actually going to lead to like the best outcomes. And then the third piece is sorry, what was I going to say? I think that there was one other one here. Yeah, I
You talked
think
about domain experts.
yeah. Oh, it's the oh yeah, trying to reorient the process. So again, I think that a lot of folks, like what you're not asking, if you're tasked with processing this document, it is a valid question to ask, like, should we be automating this? Because if you're operating in like an industry, like it's true that you probably have to process these documents, but if the specific flow today is maybe unnecessarily oriented around the fact that like this is just how we've been doing this operational process to get like from the beginning. And so now it's like, okay, hey, engineering team, automate this operational process. I do think you should take a step back as engineers, maybe put your AI hat off for a second and just think about operationally, is this the right way for us to structure our business such that this bottleneck even happens? Is there a way that we can maybe push up the bottleneck because it actually is going to allow us to clean the data a bit more and filter the problem? Or is there a way to push it down so that there's like multiple levels of filtration before it's actually getting to the point where we need to run, generative AI to like extract the data. Like you really kind of want to take a step back and actually think about the end-to-end process before you try and just like blindly automate. And I think that that's actually at a meta level relates to, like, let's say you're a vertical AI team that's trying to reinvent an industry. Like you're trying to build a new startup and you want to change, automate all these workflows. It's worth thinking through, like, okay, yeah, maybe one option is we go to X, Y, and Z business. We tell them we're going to automate your workflow for blank. We're going to automate your workflow for blank. Maybe it's like actually you go to that team and say, like, you change their approach for them. That's part of the service that you're actually providing, and changing how they think about it. And you have that power because you're going to provide a bit of a software and service model. So yeah, just rethink the process.
Makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of these other questions are mostly around just like OCR in general, but how have you guys thought about, leveraging things like LLMs and traditional OCR techniques? I think one of the
Yeah.
questions around like complex table hierarchies, for example.
I mean, so we use both OCR and VLMs in order to parse a document. So there's a lot of limitations that OCR has. There's also limitations that VLMs have. But I think it can be tempting to think that you can just like throw a document into Gemini Flash and just convert it to a markdown representation. But there's all kinds of issues that happen at the like long tail of edge cases. And so instead we think of it kind of like a multi-step process where there's like a layout step, and then you can run OCR on different sections, get the text, and you can convert, like, use VLMs for handling figures, use VLMs to repair certain types of tables. It's at the end of the day, like, and this is where there's a lot of overlap with any kind of like RAG product, is like you're trying to create the best representation of a document, and pure OCR is typically not enough. Pure VLMs are, at least right now, like not great for it, but we've actually been over time relying more and more on like multimodal models to actually process the document. But yeah, it's like you kind of need to do both, and it can be pretty complex to manage on yourself. And that is one of the reasons why we see a lot of teams end up actually using our product, is that it abstracts all this away from them. So they don't have to like think about it. They just think, okay, here's parsing, here's extraction, here's splitting, here's pipelining, etc. Here's evals. This is the actual like job to be done. I don't want to think about like OCR or Flash, etc.
Makes sense. With that, I guess let's try to do some more live questions. If you see in the bottom folder, not bottom folder, the bottom bar on Zoom, you can try to raise your hand. I know Sergio, you had a question you wanted to ask.
Yes, thank you. In part, this has been answered. So, when you say don't shoot for 100% end-to-end automation to start, this makes me thinking that the best way could be taking a product-based point of view, which is what part, asking the product side or asking the customers, what part of the automation could be your real pain point, or something that is easier, be a low-hanging fruit or whatever, and bringing the domain expert, as you implied, as a form of stakeholder deciding what parts of the automation is most necessary now, thinking of studying that a long time so that we can promise something sooner and then we go to something else later on. Also, because down the road, we learn together that some parts of the process, as you say, may change, may be no longer needed for whatever reason, because it's outdated or because it's going to be changing, something like that. So I think thinking in terms of product here would be paramount.
Yeah, no, I think, Sergio, I think you're exactly right. So like something we see very often is, especially a larger company, they'll come to us and they'll be like, look, we're so excited to use you guys. We have like 15 use cases and we want to like handle all of these. We view Extend as a way to centralize it. And like the first thing we'll say is like, you really should not try and use us to automate all 15 use cases at once. You should actually identify what is the most important thing for the business or product team right now. So like you do want to think about ROI, because at the end of the day, all of this is an investment. Like you're going to, whether you use like a provider, whether you build everything directly in-house, no matter what you do, you are investing time as a business in order to do this. And there kind of has to be an immeasurable ROI. And on top of that, there are, among all these use cases that you as a business might have, just like you have to prioritize different features for your product, you do have to like identify like, well, which of these automations are actually like realistic in the short term? What can allow us to get the fastest path to something rolled out so that we, again, can deliver business value, but then also there's less like friction to roll this out, less change management, so the business as a whole the product can get comfortable with this kind of automation on an easier use case, and then we can start to attack the other ones. So it is kind of like a product question, and that is why, very often some of the people that we end up talking to during the discovery process is a PM. Or it's like there is like a management component. You are fundamentally changing the product, because even if it's an internal back office flow, like that is still part of your end product in the market, right? If you're a business doing this automation behind the scenes, if you change how you do that, it will change how you provide service in that market. So, yeah.
Sense. The next question, I think, is from Srirang.
Hey, thank you. I'm not going to put my camera on. I had my
No worries.
tooth extracted, so I look like an inhuman chipmunk, actually. Anyway, did you mentioned that the client forms could have high degree of variance in EHR. So is that something that you kind of hinting at ontology build out in terms of understanding the real data at the back end that and kind of map those to that? That's my first question. I'll slip in another one too. I would love to know about the extraction classifiers that you talk about. Thanks.
Yeah. So the first question, I mean, so it's in that case of like the healthcare vertical AI, it's really like they need to sort of build out this ontology, right? They need to work with their customers, in particular, in this case, like their in-house like nursing and technician team, to understand what are in all these documents. Like if you have some generic, the concept of like a referral order package in home health, what are all the potential documents that could be there, even ones we don't need, just so we can have like an understanding, a representation of like what is the possible document set? Like, what are you as a nurse when you get one of these packages and you have to like transfer the system of record from like one doctor to for this patient to your incoming system? How are you actually like thinking about it? What are you implicitly doing that you don't actually even have it written down? And that's kind of like the ontology piece, though, is more like what are the specific terminologies, like how someone might actually refer to a physician. Because also in a lot of these referral orders, you can have multiple physicians being mentioned at different times, but there is like a primary physician. Like that is like a specific thing that they need to figure out, but it might not be referred to as primary physician. So that is kind of like the ontology piece that they have to do. And again, part of why a lot of teams actually work with us is that we free up the time for them to focus on that. That's like very specific to their domain, because everything else is handled for them with the tooling and the kind of the ways they can stitch this all together so that they can really understand their data. And then once you understand that ontology and the data, it's actually relatively easy to kind of figure out how to automate there. I think you also mentioned the classification in Copoly. So we are very soon rolling out an update to our classifier that utilizes Copoly as part of a retrieval step, similar for like one of the things that our customers often want is they want to do kind of like schema mapping automatically. So again, they do it somewhat manually right now, where they'll create all these different extractors in our product, and then they will maybe do a first step where they extract like provider and all these different things, and then they will map like provider, then extract this. What they really want to be able to do is say, like, for this exact kind of document, I just wanted to do this. For this exact kind of document, I want to do that. And as part of the retrieval building, that Copoly is actually a component of that, because it's extremely good at this sort of like of all the things it can do really, really well, it is this like the very subtle differences between documents like a BOL versus a proof of lading, which is like a BOL with like a signature. It's like this kind of difference is easy to like assess, and then you can build much more fine-grained mapping. That makes sense.
Makes sense. Do you guys, by any chance, you also looked at multi-vector, like a late interaction with Maxim?
We have not yet. No, I would love to.
Okay. I just heard a talk the other day where somebody was pumping this quite a bit, and a whole bunch of vector databases are now getting into multiple vectors, late interaction. A little bit more work, but they were saying the accuracy was a little 10% or 15% more. Anyhow, thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that goes back to this idea that we have to have our own evals, right? It might work 10% better on the like Wikipedia question answering data set.
Yeah.
But I guess, Eli, in this case, this is almost like nearest neighbors on PDF layouts.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Exactly. And I do think that that is sometimes the danger of like all the benchmarking is that it can be it can lead to people potentially making snap decisions to try and upgrade something when in practice might actually be better for what they're trying to do. And
Yeah.
I mean, like I think a perfect example of this, I mean, Jason, we were talking about this like the other day, is like going back to sort of the retrieval stuff, like the fact that most of the coding agents ended up just using grep, and everyone was trying to optimize the like semantic retrieval as much as they could, keep climbing the hill of like benchmarking results. And then just turned out actually for what we're really trying to do, we eval this end to end and figure out like what leads to the best outcome. It's actually just giving the agent access to grep. So I do, yeah, that really gets at the like, you have to think about it from the end, both the eval at your specific step and the end to end all encompassing eval. Like, did we get the outcome here on our specific use case? And then work backwards from there.
Yeah. And I also call out, maybe even a year ago, my belief was that if you could figure out the success rates of every component, then like you kind of multiply them together and you kind of know the end-to-end
Right.
performance of the system. I think now with this agentic work, that isn't really the case either, right? Like a couple of weeks ago, Colin from Augment had this talk and basically they said, like we improved our like embedding search by N%. The end-to-end performance didn't change
Right.
because the agent just tried 2 more times.
Right.
So now, like the metric isn't even like, did you get the answer correctly? It's like, how many tries did it take for it to get it done correctly? And also, does that matter, right? In a zero latency, like, sorry, no latency concern setting, that's actually fine. You can actually build a product.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those are the kind of things that now have really surprised me and changed how I think about building out some of these agents.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that also gets another thing too, is like when you have these agent flows, you introduce potential, like a lot of indeterminism that's hard to sometimes reason about. And I think it can be tempting to use like AI or like an LLM for like every step of every flow. But there are a lot of cases, especially in document processing, where if you can solve it with code, like let's say you want to do some kind of like extraction where if you actually just extract the component parts and then use like, math to get the inferred result as opposed to asking the model to infer the outcome as part of the extraction, then you should do the code-based approach, right? Because then you can actually guarantee it's going to behave how you want. And yeah, so like making the trade-off of indeterminism versus determinism is pretty important.
Beautiful. I think that's basically at time. To everyone else who's still here, we will send some like study notes out as well as any resources that Eli wants to share, maybe the slide, maybe a link to extend. But before we go, yeah, is there any like final message or how can we find you if you want to reach
Yeah.
out?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at twitter.com ebadgio with an underscore, because for some reason it was taken without an underscore. And also on LinkedIn as Eli Badgio. Feel free to message me anytime or email me at eli@extend.app. You can find our product at extend.ai. Would love to keep chatting this. I mean, this is all we do every single day is kind of live and breathe document processing. We sort of refer to ourselves as your document processing team, and just love just thinking through the problems. Really interesting stuff. One of the most interesting things about working on document processing is just how much you learn about every industry. It is like very, very fun. So yeah, always excited to chat.
Yeah, now I know who to ask for when I have issues with insurance claims. I'll just reach out
Oh
to
my
you
God.
instead.
Yeah.
Awesome. Eli, on behalf of everyone, thank you so much for sharing your
Yeah.
knowledge.